Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The world today is marking International Youth Day. And the theme this year is Youth Engagement for Global Action. This theme opens up the discussion for how the youth is reacting and engaging with socio-political issues today and how their engagement is being received and included by decision makers. We also take a look at how, given the economic and political climate, can more efforts be made to include the young individuals from varying backgrounds and give them better opportunities. Joining us for this discussion is Professor Dana R. Fisher, who's a professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Maryland. Her research focuses on studying democracy, civic participation, activism, and environmental policy making. And she's also the author of 6 books, which include Activism, Inc. and American Resistance. She joins us from Washington, D.C. Also joining us today is Mr. Uchechukwu Okorie, who's an executive vice president of the Junior Chamber International in Nigeria. Junior Chamber International is a nonprofit organization and a worldwide federation of young active citizens. He joins us from Port Harcourt. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. I'm going to begin the discussion from a very general question, but hopefully that will help us build on to our conversation better. Professor Dana R. Fisher, I'll first take this to you. Now, given the various avenues that allow our youth to be more exposed to information, to news, whether it's social media or the more globalized networks that allow information from getting from one place to the other, do you think today's generation is more politically active and aware than the previous generations?
I think today's generation is absolutely more engaged and more aware of what's going on around them and around the world. And I think you explain it very well here. The fact that social media is so readily available through digital devices of all sorts means that people are able to learn about what's going on around them. And it's a lot harder for young people to be able to access whatever information they want. And you're showing these wonderful images from many of the youth climate strikes around the world. And I study them, and I can tell you that young people have gotten engaged in this issue in unprecedented ways in recent years. And there's no reason to think that will go away, particularly as the planet continues to warm and we see extreme weather take place around the world.
Right. And to try to understand how your point is global, I think it makes sense to ask Uchechukwu if this is also the case in Nigeria, if this is also something that's being witnessed in parts of Africa.
The youths in this part of the world, I think and I believe that they are also active, very active people, and people with goals, people who are more engaged. I feel we are more engaged now, but with much distractions. I think the youths around would need to have more interaction with their active communities to really be able to enjoy engaging with the global community.
Right. Now, when we about this experience of more and more young individuals coming out to the streets, especially to join protests like the climate strikes we've been seeing, many other movements that have been happening, revolutionary movements across the world, the question that arises is whether their voices are registered in the same manner that the more mature voices, more mature political activists' voices are. Professor Fisher, to this point, do you think that's happening, that governments, policymakers are taking them seriously enough?
I think that government actors do not take young people seriously enough. I think that has been a problem for many, many generations now. But what I think is really interesting about the current generation is the fact that these young people are starting to think about tactics that they are able to employ that get them attention, so that the media is paying a lot of attention to the way they engage, and it gives them new channels into decision making that more institutionalized actors like a formal NGO that's involved in the negotiating process through the UN, for example, may not have.
Right. Now, when we talk about the United States specifically, more than half of its total population is made up of millennials and younger people. When we talk about why it's important for there to be engagement with them at a deeper level, to include them in policy making, what benefits does that have?
The benefit of engaging young people is not unique to the United States, but is certainly the United States is representative of this issue. It's that the young people are the future. We just yesterday announced somebody who is from a younger generation who's running as vice president. Kamala Harris has just been named as the vice presidential running mate of Joe Biden. And by having a young person on the ballot, it provides opportunities for young people to see people like themselves or people who are closer in age to them whom they can support in office. And I think that that shows the ways that young people who have already taken to the streets have already started to get involved and pay more and more attention to politics in our country and other places, to start to think about the ways that their activism can channel into political outcomes, but also into political representation.
Right. Uchechukwu, when we talk about students, when we talk about how much of the population belongs to young people, Nigeria is an ideal example of that because it has the third largest youngest population in the world. And yet, despite that, we see many, many challenges for the youth. There is extremely high youth unemployment. 1 out of every 5 out-of-school children in the world is in Nigeria. Given all these problems, do you think they could have been better solved had the process of involving the youth in decisions and policy making been taken into consideration?
I agree quite well with Professor Fisher when she mentioned that the way this generation is trying to engage with leaders is a bit different, and it's even being impactful also. I take, for instance, Nigeria. We have over 60% of the population youths, and it will be insane for anyone not to consider them, especially when they try to engage. Now, with the statistics you've already raised and the statistics you have mentioned so far, I think it will be only gainful for leaders and government to engage, to have an inclusion of youth to solve these challenges. If we are to move from this phase, but I tell you, we have a lot of bright minds, we have a lot of people who are ready to engage, but would need to engage more actively via media and other platforms to get the government to pay attention. I think it will go a lot to solve these issues, especially in Nigeria, where I represent.
Right. Now, when we're talking to youth, I don't want to be unaware or not bring this up into the conversation. Of course, the youth itself is not just one large group. There are many other factions. Some groups get more representation than others. I will take this question to Professor Fisher because this is exactly the kind of work she deals with. But before that, Mr. Uchechukwu, let's talk about where you're from. Do you see that there are some voices amongst the young individuals that are heard more than others? And when we talk about this process of decision-making being truly inclusive, how many more groups need to be included in that?
I don't know if you follow the Nigerian media so well. You'll be hearing about a young man called Okorie, also a former presidential aspirant. Also, you'll be hearing about Deji Ayanu, a socio-political activist who is in the front role of making government see the challenges of youth. I think there are a lot of youths that are also being engaged. I am not saying they are none, but we need to have more active participation, more youth in the forefront. So for me, there are youths that are engaging, but I think the efforts are not enough. Until more people come out to engage, I think then they will be taking us seriously.
Right, Professor Fisher, now the United Nations highlighted this, that individuals that are included in the debate belong to certain family backgrounds, they have certain privileges, they belong to elite educational institutions. That's why their voices are amplified and heard more. Now, this process of activism, this process of engagement truly needs to be inclusive in order for there to be enough representation. How do we get to that point, especially when we talk about a society like the United States, where there are such deep-rooted issues about racism, about class divisions? How do we get to that point of creating an inclusive environment for all young individuals?
That's a very important question. And my research has actually found that while we have seen a lot more young people of color taking to the streets and getting politically engaged in recent months, particularly since the untimely death of George Floyd, what we basically have found is when we survey people in the crowd, while they're predominantly young people, they also predominantly come from families that are highly educated. So we're continuing to see the replication of inequalities in the ways that you're talking about with representation in the street. So with regard to how to solve this problem, it's a tough question, but one of the things that I think is really important is to think about the ways that people can engage in their communities. So if we think about all of the people who are in the streets, who represent a lot more racial diversity than we've seen in recent years, if we see those people going back into communities of color particularly, or frontline communities, and mobilizing people and communicating politically with the young people in their communities, it will help to engage and hopefully enfranchise people who have otherwise felt like they were left out of conversations.
You bring up the tragic killing of George Floyd here, and I think it's really important, especially to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement and why it was such a historic point in America's history, why it continues to be such an important moment. What impact has that had on the youth, on young people, their minds, their political leanings? I know it's difficult to summarize all of this in one answer, but did you see a change, a radical shift?
Well, the killing of George Floyd provided a really important moment for young people, particularly in America, because first of all, we have an economic cratering, as many other countries do due to COVID-19. At the same time, or because of that, we see a lot of young people who have been stuck at home if they're in school only digitally. And we also know that people who feel, who are at risk of very, very, the worst health consequences of the disease are mostly older people. So young people feel like they are empowered to participate in ways that older people don't. And as a result of that, we see a lot more young people going out into the streets and participating in protests. And not only have we seen people of color joining these protests, but as you're showing in these pictures, we see lots of what we consider to be white allies who have participated. We are in this moment, what we think of as this large-term cycle of contention, where we've seen people in the streets in sustained activism since the inauguration of Donald Trump in 2017. And as a result of that, there are lots of people who have become engaged and started paying attention, who are now paying attention to issues having to do with racial inequalities and structural racism in our country. So as a result, we see a very diverse group of people in the streets who at the same time do not represent, necessarily as much class diversity as we would hope, but it's a much more diverse group of people who are out there and they're paying attention. And what's interesting is a lot of institutional actors, be they businesses or government actors at the state level, at the city level, to some degree at the federal level, have been paying attention. And that's because of these large-scale sustained protests that we've seen.
Right. Mr. Uchechukwu, now, I began our questions and our discussion by talking about the impact of social media and how it creates more political awareness. Now, one thing to discuss of interest as well is how political movements in one part of the world create waves all across the world. BLM was an ideal example of this because we saw the discussion not just being in America, it came out and it was adopted within Asia, it was adopted in many other spheres in the world. When we talk about political movements in one part of the world, how do you think they mobilize or help other youth activists to mobilize by seeing those examples?
I think the key word there is to build consciousness. Those movements they've tried to transcend boundaries, especially down here in the part of the world. I think there's this transition in building consciousness in young people. making them engage more. So for me, part of our processes and achievements in engagement is geared towards what is happening in other parts of the world. And for youth around this place, it's a part of globalization thing, especially with the advent of social media. So what is happening there, it may be taking a longer time out here, but I think we are gradually meeting up with other parts of the world. And so consciousness and education not quite being done here. If it's done properly, I think the revolution will go around.
And when we talk about education here, how do you think those challenges can be overcome, especially when we talk about inaccess of education to so many young people, and how that really does deprive them of so many later on opportunities in life? How can countries that are developing nations deal with this, and how can Nigeria deal with what we're seeing, such a huge children out of school ratio?
There has to be a policy shift. There has to be a new way of thinking. Our leaders and our governments and even young people supposed to adopt new trends. So if policies are designed to take these people out of the streets, if policies are implemented also in taking these people out of the streets, I think there will be this equality we are looking for. But where this is not happening, I want to say we'll still remain at this point. But education will be driven by policies, shift in policies, implementation of these policies, and effective monitoring. There must be monitoring of these policies when implemented.
Right. Professor, what Uchechukwu just talked about, how much of that resonates with you? Because the COVID-19 crisis has really made fault lines within the education sector, even in developed parts of the world, more evident. And we know how inaccess to education is not just a regional issue, but a global issue. How much of what he said about policy shifts do you agree with there?
I think policy shifts are really important, but I think that at least what we're seeing in my part of the developed world is that policy shifts may very well be driven by pressures from outside the government. And that, I think, is where we see a lot of young people pressuring through Black Lives Matter movement and other movements, the youth climate movement as well right now. And so far, while we haven't seen a lot of policy outcomes coming from it yet, there's a lot of momentum building. And it looks like there may be opportunities for success here. I think the fact that many universities now in the United States are starting to say they're going remote again, even though they were originally planning on opening due to the pandemic and the fact that the pandemic is so widespread here in our country, that means there'll be a lot more young people available to get out in the streets. So I expect that we are going to see a very active fall leading up to and even beyond the election in November.
Professor Fisher, as we talk about activism, a personal observation that I would like to take to you, because since you're the expert on this, it seems like activism for the youth is a double-edged sword. While their voices can be registered and heard, they're also stereotyped often. They're also demonized. They're also seen as being troublemakers for that activism. And this isn't just when they are a part of national movements, but when they're more active on campuses, when they're more outspoken about certain things. Is it a double-edged sword in this case?
I actually think that activists, what you're describing is how a lot of people who engage in activism can be criticized, and it's not just for young people, although it's probably easier for young people to be attacked because they're young and they don't have a lot of experience to respond to such an attack. But I actually think that young people and their ways that they're engaging in activism these days is refreshing. They are open to new tactics and innovations, such as the school strike, which really shows this opportunity for speaking out to large groups of the population.
And Professor Fisher, sorry to interject here, but just that example, the school strike, is exactly what I've been getting at. Talking to many analysts, many voice this concern, how this is taking away from the need to be in school. It's a distraction. These movements, in fact, are nothing but just optics and there needs to be stuff that can be done, but while keeping kids in school. This is the type of criticism we're hearing.
Well, the school strike movement does not tell people to leave school. They come out of school on Fridays, and in most cases, they work with their teachers so that they have opportunities to continue learning. So this isn't about an anti-school movement whatsoever. I think that's what we would consider to be a reframing by people who want to criticize a movement. I think that there is no question that learning about democracy is best done by active learning and participation, and that is exactly what the school strike movement does. It provides opportunities for young people and old people alike to learn about democracy and how to participate in, governance broadly defined by doing.
Right. Mr. Uchechukwu, when we talk about learning about democracy, how individuals can engage with it, we hear this criticism as well, that actors don't want young people to be overly critical. They create a curriculum in a manner which hinders their critical thinking. A lot of things are done in order to prevent those questions from coming up. Do you see this as a case in Nigeria, where you're talking to us from? And do you think that this can be bypassed through changing curriculum and changing the way we teach children?
Well, the actors would want to suit curriculum to fit what they want. But I see youths, I see young people becoming creative, not just depending on the curriculum, not just depending on the actors, but coming to drive a process where they create the demand for inclusion. So this part of the world, I see people that are tired of the old ways, they are tired of the old policies, they are tired of how things have been done, but they are creating a new form of engagement, a new style of engagement to get what they want. So the curriculum may not be moved outrightly, but I think a new way, creative way would be, there's a way to go around it to get actual results. So for us in Nigeria and this part of the world, or the developing world, the actors may not grant you those opportunity to change curriculum per se, but youths are already, due to enlightenment and education, they're already having other ways, creative ways, like engaging Twitter hashtags and other relevant platforms to get this done.
I'm going to just put one last question. When we've been talking about high rates of out-of-school children, we've been talking about high rates of youth unemployment. These are all concerns that directly are related to the youth. How have they put these concerns and their demands forward to the government in recent years? Do we see that creativity translating in how they put forth their demands?
A couple of CSO, community organizations, a couple of organizations have come on board to channel this social democratic network, and some few, they've come out to channel these grievances, these pains. They've come out to tell the world, this is our story, even though no one will want to hear it this way. They've come out to really engage governments and actors on this front. So their creativity goes from advocacy discussions, and also meeting key stakeholders, holding of meetings, physical engagement, not just on social media, and protests. I hope you are aware of the August 5th Revolution Now movement that happened in Nigeria. It was a way of engaging the government, telling them these issues are endemic and we wouldn't want to have them again. So they are creative, using every form of media and support they have through public opinions.
Right. Professor Fisher, I'm going to leave that last question to you as well. When we're talking about creativity and how that's being translated in the way young people are trying to become more politically active and engaging, what are the standout examples for you?
Examples of the ways that young people are becoming engaged, I would say, are exactly as my colleague was just discussing. The ways that there is this range of engagement that we see young people doing. They're extremely savvy in understanding that activism can't just take place online. And so while they use technology to get the word out and do it across borders, and we've seen that with many different movements recently, at the same time, they are able to translate that into face-to-face engagement, face-to-face actions, communication with policymakers to get their voices heard. And I think it's really working. This suite of engagement and suite of democratic tools is exactly what's needed to be effective, because you can't be ignored when you're coming from all sides. And I think that's what we're seeing now, and I think we'll see more of it in the months to come.
Right, that leaves us on a very optimistic note. Thank you so much, Professor Dana R. Fisher, for joining us, Mr. Uchechukwu Okorie for joining us. We're going to go for a short break. When we return, we're going to continue our discussion. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Now, as we discuss International Youth Day, it's imperative to bring voices into the conversation which directly deal with young individuals and work to help them secure better opportunities for themselves. Now, joining us for this conversation is Ahmad, who is serving as president of a youth-led organization called MAPS, which works for capacity building of young people. He's also the recipient of the Diana Award and also was the youngest Pakistani to speak at the United Nations headquarters. He joins us from Rahim Yar Khan. Also joining us today is Mr. David Pavlu, who's a student and is also recently elected into Parliament on a communal level. He joins us from Basel. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. I'm going to begin with something that connects us to the previous conversation we were having in this show today, which was talking about how engaged is our youth with the politics of today. Ahmad, I'd like to begin with you. Do you believe that there's a political disconnect between the youth and the policymakers?
Yes, thank you so much for bringing this topic up. And I would love to tell you that there's a huge difference between the policymakers and the engagement of young people. I've been emphasizing on this topic that we need to include young people in decision-making processing and the policy-making process, which involves young politicians where we are lacking. Like if you're talking about the National Assembly or provincial assemblies of any province, you'll see a less amount of young politicians who are making legislations and making policies. So I think and I believe that young people like us and in any other province or any other cities should be given a chance to come up and be working for policy making process and legislative process.
Right, Ahmad, I'm going to talk more about how your organization helps the youth to do that, but I want to take this question to David since he is politically active in that manner. David, how much of a difference does it make when politicians are young, when politicians can relate to the issues of the youth a little more? When we talk about the economic climate, employment opportunities, do you see those as being the central issues?
I would love to discuss about the entrepreneurial opportunities in Pakistan, and that connects us with the decision-making process also at the same time, because there's a lack of there's a lot of people and there are a lot of graduates who graduates in their final semester and they don't have the opportunity to work for the government process because there's a quota system in every government department. And if we're talking about 1,000 graduates, there would be one or two of them will be working for the government. So yes, there's a lack of opportunities.
Ahmad, how does your organization work for youth capacity building exercises? What does it exactly do in order to bridge those gaps you were talking to us about?
All right, we started this foundation, MAPS, a youth-led organization back in 2012 with an aim to, enhance the capacity building of young people, like enhancing their leadership and management qualities. Like this organization originates from South Punjab of Pakistan. So we wanted to, enhance the qualities of young people, a student who literally came to the university asking for professional skills to learn with technical education at the same time. So we started conducting workshops, trainings, trainings on different topics, which includes civic engagement, talking about, working with a diverse community, at the same time enhancing their leadership and management qualities. So for doing that, we've been conducting surveys and education expos and conferences at the same time. And we also initiate a global project in 2018, which is called as Global Peace Chain, which you can have this all the information but by just typing Global Peace Chain on Google. We believe that we wanted to preach a message of peace, love, and interfaith harmony. So we initiated that project, and which says that violence has nothing to do with caste, color, creed, or any religion, because we believe that we should promote peace by dialogue rather than wars and economical warfare at the same time. Now what the big four is, fifth generation war. So we have to convey a message of peace and love to the different countries, because we really want to initiate dialogues between those countries who have conflicts. So that's how we are engaging youth in different topics according to different themes in different countries. Right now we are existing in more than 100 countries.